Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start by just taking a moment to express my deepest condolences to Mr. Rosenberg. You have experienced a profound loss, and I am so sorry for that, and I appreciate your coming to share Drew's story with us today. Mr. Chairman, I'm glad to see that we're having an immigration hearing that's not solely focused on the border, but unfortunately I worry that today's hearing will feature more of the same dangerous and harmful rhetoric that some of my colleagues use to demonize and scapegoat immigrants. For the last 6 months, and really since President Biden took office, my colleagues have fearmongered about the border and asylum seekers seeking refuge. This reached a fever pitch in May when the administration was set to end Title 42 public health policy. We were told that ending this policy that's supposed to be about public health and not about immigration would result in high numbers of migrants coming across the border and that the administration was not prepared to deal with the influx. But there was no influx. Like it or not, President Biden's border plan appears to be working. Over the past 2 months, border numbers have fallen nearly 70%, despite every projection to the contrary. Politico has called it the migrant crisis that still hasn't arrived. So, unable to further stoke fears about the border, my colleagues then turned to discussing the potential impeachment of Secretary Mayorkas during a hearing last month, and I was very pleased to see that following the hearing, some of our Republican colleagues on the committee, including the chairman of this subcommittee, expressed appropriate reservations about impeaching the secretary. I hope that my colleagues will realize that we can disagree about immigration policy without resorting to impeachment. Unable to move farther down the path on impeachment in this committee handed off that investigation to the House Homeland Security Committee. And now it appears that my Republican colleagues are pivoting to painting immigrants as criminals. As we discussed at our last hearing, Congress has never appropriated and no administration has ever requested sufficient resources to detain all non-citizens who fall under the, quote, mandatory detention categories. Even former President Trump never tried to detain all migrants. In fact, DHS's own data shows over 500,000 releases at the U.S.-Mexico border under the Trump administration. Likewise, no administration has ever requested or been provided the resources to remove all undocumented non-citizens. There are currently about 11 million undocumented individuals in the United States. And given the Department of Homeland Security's finite resources, prosecutorial discretion is an essential tool in managing the immigration system. When President Biden took office, his administration moved to implement a targeted set of enforcement priorities. These priorities, while not perfect, attempt to focus finite resources on the removal of individuals deemed to be a threat to public safety, national security, or border security. Although this was initially blocked in the lower courts, in June the Supreme Court held that states cannot challenge the executive branch's authority to establish enforcement priorities. And the court also ruled that courts do not have the authority to order law enforcement to carry out arrests and deportation. The Biden administration has stated that it plans to re-implement these enforcement priorities. Prosecutorial discretion in enforcement has long been an essential element of the executive branch's authority. And I am glad that the Biden administration and the Department of Homeland Security can move forward with immigration enforcement priorities. However, I do remain concerned about the administration's reliance on state and local law enforcement to carry out immigration enforcement. Local law enforcement needs to have the trust of all members of the community, including immigrants, to do their jobs. But that trust is eroded when local law enforcement is tasked with enforcing federal immigration policy. The Major Cities Chiefs Association has previously noted that if law enforcement officers are viewed by members of the immigrant community as colluding or working with immigration law enforcement officers, this would, quote, result in increased crime against immigrants in the broader community, create a class of silent victims, and eliminate the potential for assistance from immigrants in solving crimes or preventing future terrorist acts, end quote. The Major Cities Chiefs Association has also explained that cooperation with the immigrant community is a crucial part of solving crime and preventing further criminal activity within the entire community. Congress recognized this dynamic with strong bipartisan support when we created the U-Visa program to protect immigrant victims and witnesses of crime, to encourage those immigrants to come forward, report crimes, and cooperate with law enforcement to solve crimes. It's worth noting that when local law enforcement is deputized to enforce federal immigration law, it makes it far more difficult for victims of domestic violence and sexual assault to seek protection, and it empowers their abusers. So I'm sure we will hear a lot about immigrants and crime today. Demonizing all immigrants and attempting to scare the public while using white nationalist rhetoric is straight out of Stephen Miller, and former President Trump's playbook. The reality is immigrants commit crimes at lower levels, and this type of rhetoric only fuels a rising hate that we have seen against immigrant communities. I do want to note that one of the witnesses is here to discuss Chilean nationals potentially abusing the visa waiver program. If any immigrant is abusing the immigration system, I think we all agree this is something that DHS should be looking into. The visa waiver program is a privilege that we award to certain countries. It is not a right. I look forward to hearing from all of our witnesses today and the perspectives that they bring on this issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.